Hello again. You might be surprised to hear from me so soon, considering that it took me 5 months to read through Crossroads of Twilight, but it took me a little over a week and a half to read Knife of Dreams. For those of you unfamiliar, I will give you the hyper quick, up to speed recap. I probably have ADHD. I'm on a 5-year waiting list to get diagnosed. I find it very difficult to read some books, and Wheel of Time is something of a stamina test for me. We're currently up to 3 years of reading through this series as of this month. Longtime fans of a series will be aware that the pacing becomes glacial throughout the series. And as someone from the outside, I had often heard this, and I had also heard that it was worth it, and that it got really good at the end again, and that quote-unquote Brandon Sanderson fixes the pacing. I am here to tell you that Robert Jordan fixed the pacing. Whatever Brandon Sanderson does after this, and I'm sure it'll be fantastic, and I'm looking forward to it. It's one of the reasons I actually decided to pick this series up, because I was so curious as to how someone finishes someone else's epic fantasy series, and because I'm a fan of Brando Sando. Whatever Brandon Sanderson does with the last 3 books, I've got to say, I am so thankful to be able to sit here and tell you that Robert Jordan, with his last book, fixed the pacing of the series. This book was phenomenal. It was a return to form. It reminded me why I enjoyed those early Wheel of Time books so goddamn much. So much happens in this book. So much happens in this book. Like, in the previous, 4 or 5 books, I'd gotten used to this feeling of, you have to get through the slow chapters, because for every 5 or 6 slow chapters, there's one chapter where something happens and it's really good, and then you get back to another 5 or 6 slow chapters. That's inverted for this book. There's one slow chapter every 5 or 6, maybe not even that. I would say actually maybe there's only 2 or 3 quote-unquote slow chapters in this book overall, and even the slow chapters weren't as slow as the slow chapters in previous books. I've read somewhere before that Robert Jordan intended for this to be the penultimate book. He said that after Knife of Dreams there would be one final book, A Memory of Light, and that would finish the series. And obviously Harriet McDougal and Brandon Sanderson kind of came to the decision that it would take 3 more books based on the amount of stuff that still needed to happen. But yeah, for many reasons, Knife of Dreams feels like a penultimate book. It really feels like now we've got all of these different story threads which are starting to not necessarily come together, but draw to a close in some ways, and they're really set on a collision course in other ways. The amount of payoffs in this book alone it's been delightful. And partially the reason for my reading speed was because I was really trying to kick myself into gear and be like, now listen here, me, we're gonna get this series finished. It's been long enough, but that was also helped along greatly by the quality of the actual book. I've said before that the pacing of Wheel of Time is interesting because while it can get glacially slow, it's also it lends itself to a much more detailed world than you might otherwise be used to, and much greater payoffs for when things actually do happen. So keeping that in mind, this entire book being full of payoffs and events happening, I just cannot overstate enough how good this book is. So let's go through the events of a book. I find it really funny that the website that I used to recap the summary of the events of the entire book for the previous book was 4 paragraphs, and then for this book is 15 paragraphs. I haven't counted, but that's kind of, you know what I mean. This book opened with a banger of a prologue, by the way. Most prologues I roll my eyes at and I go, okay, this is all set up, this is all characters I'm not that familiar with, characters I don't really have a vested interest in, chapters where not much is going to quote-unquote happen. I keep saying quote-unquote in this video, don't I? This prologue was Galad leading a bunch of White Cloaks to Emenvalda for working with the Shonchen and for disrespecting and mistreating Galad's mother, and Galad defeated him in single combat, and it was such a good chapter. Knife of Dreams is chock full of battles and fighting, and this really set the tone for the entire book. Perrin finally rescues Fael in this book. He continues becoming ruthless and relentless, and he makes an alliance with the Shonchen and enacts this plan to poison the wise ones of the Shido Aiel with fork roots so that most of them can't channel, and kind of leads this collaborative army, which we're seeing a lot of, by the way. We're seeing a lot of these different factions beginning to intermingle. And so in Perrin's army here, you've got the Two Rivers men, but you've also got some Aes Sedai and some Seanchan, who would never have fought alongside each other before. And you've got the Prophets men as well. And I believe you've also got armies from various places which Rand originally sent Perrin away with, but I might be wrong on that front. You've got some Aiel thrown in there for sure. On Matt's side of things, first of all, we've got this massive reveal, which I absolutely adored, of the letter that Tom Maryland has been reading this entire time. I think we were supposed to know that it was Moraine's letter and I just forgot, but I don't think we knew the contents of a letter at all. But he was reading it because Moraine had some timey-wimey nonsense written in it where she was like, do not show Matt this letter until he asks for it. That is imperative. And so you've got one of the slower, fairly standard chapters where Matt's kind of chatting up to on, interrupted by this massive revelation of, hey, Moraine's alive, by the way, which part of me kind of always knew she would be. The fact that I had any doubt at all as to whether Moraine was really dead was, I remember in a previous video being like, but I don't know, man. Her link with Lan was severed, so that must mean she's dead, right? And then I was like, I don't know, but if I'm questioning it that way, then there's clearly something to question. There were hints. I don't necessarily remember the hints themselves, but I remember that there were hints that she was alive. And so I'm interested to see where that goes after this book. But, she's like, oh, you can come rescue me if you want. You don't have to, though. I've seen visions where 3 of you come and rescue me, where 3 of you come and rescue me and 1 of you die, where 3 of you come and rescue me and 2 of you die, and then you come and rescue me and all of us die, and it's like this wild nonsense. Although I have to wonder, I'm now getting to the point in Wheel of Time where I'm looking back at the events of the entire story, and I'm looking at characters and I'm going, what is the point of you within the overall narrative? And I have to wonder, what is the point of Moraine being alive for the overall narrative? What purpose does that serve besides just being cool? And it's perfectly fine if it's just cool, but when Moraine comes back, what does that add to the narrative? That is something I am interested to see. Maybe it's just that she's a really competent, wielder of the one power, and we need her in the fight against the final battle. But yeah, Matt did the gif where he went, huh. Anyway, and then the rest of Matt's storyline was about him kind of working with Aludra to create new weapons of war, and we see these fast reloading crossbows, and we see the beginnings of what's eventually probably going to be guns. And I really love the small detail that in one of Egwene's dreams, she foresees Matt kind of bowling these bowling balls against these bowling pins. It's not put that way because bowling doesn't exist in the Wheel of Time, but that's pretty much what he's doing. And the pins are meant to symbolize massive numbers of lives, and it's basically, I find it really hard to kind of interpret prophecy in these books because I'm listening to them as audiobooks, and so if I was reading them as paperback books, I would mark the page maybe and flip back to it and be like, oh, this could mean this and stuff, but I don't reread these passages over and over again. They don't get cemented in my mind, so I don't know what to look for. But I think this one was a pretty plainly obvious one of, Egwene is horrified because she sees Matt setting up all of these soldiers to be killed in these wars that he is engaging in with these superior weapons that he's inventing with Aludra. And just as we see Perrin become more relentless and hardened to the horrors of war, we also see Matt in the same kind of way become more ruthless and hardened to the horrors of war. Some of those scenes later on in Matt's arc, this book, where you see him funneling all of the Seanchan through these narrow passes and then just decimating them with crossbows. Decimating doesn't mean that, but that's how we've come to mean that word. Just slaughtering these armies of men many times greater than the amount of men that he has, and just, seeing them die. The descriptions Robert Jordan gives us of they don't all just immediately die. Some of them have shattered legs and arms, and they're in great pain and they take ages to die. Robert Jordan's really driving home the horrors of war in this book, and I love it. At the same time, though, we don't get these paragraphs of regret and ruminating on the horrors of war from Matt or from Perrin because it's become normalized for them. You get the occasional sentence Matt could still hear the screams. You get the idea that it's affecting them on some level, but it's not really a book where you stop and you think the horrors of war are shown to you as the reader. They're not told to you from the perspective of these characters, which is interesting. And I do wonder if that's going to be addressed by the end of the book, just how far everyone has come and how much they've lost in how much they've had to grow for the world around them to continue to survive. Anyway, by the end of Matt's arc in this book, he ends up marrying Tuon, or I guess I should say Tuon ends up marrying him, and he becomes a prince, except he's not a prince. He thinks he's a prince because Tuon still thinks she's just the daughter of the nine moons or whatever. She thinks she's still like the princess or whatever, but she doesn't know her entire family's been killed and she's actually the empress, which I guess would make Matt the emperor of Seanchan, which is just, or Shonda or whatever, which is just wild. Looking forward to that little revelation probably in the next book. Also, quick aside, the Forsaken decide to say, don't kill Rand, but we will now hunt Matt and Perrin with renewed vigor, which I don't really see happening in this book all that much, so maybe that's just more setting up for future books. You do have Seanchan forces which want to kill Tuon, attacking Matt, and you could argue that that's that work of the Forsaken, but that's very underhanded. Elaine is pretty much who I'm talking about when I say that this book still has some slow chapters. There are still a decent amount of paragraphs dedicated to Elaine trying to keep her handle on ruling Caemlyn, even though she's not technically ruling yet. She's still besieged, and she's talking about all these different royal houses and trying to win their favor, and I'm like, yeah, okay, come on. Come on. But even then, towards the end of the book, Elaine's chapters do become a lot more interesting as she decides to try and intercept the Black Archer. And I think it's really interesting how Elaine has been told by Min that she will give birth to these two healthy babies, and Elaine has taken that to mean that she's basically safe until then in terms of health. Like, while she acknowledges that that doesn't mean that she will be the ruler of Caemlyn, or that she will succeed, or that she will even be in a good place when she's giving birth to these healthy babies, she does become a little bit arrogant due to this prophecy, and that is her downfall. Well, not her, and she doesn't, completely fail, but she gets kidnapped, and there's a lot of unnecessary loss of life. And I'd even go so far as to say Elaine doesn't even really take responsibility for it as much as maybe she should. There's a line where, Brigitte mentions that Elaine doesn't feel sad at all. No, she feels sad. She doesn't feel fear. Like, even when she's been kidnapped, she doesn't feel fear. And then from Elaine's perspective, we hear that she doesn't feel guilty because obviously what was done to her and what was done to the Aes Sedai that she was with was still perpetrated by the Black Archer, but she doesn't feel guilty. And I feel like she should. She should feel a little bit guilty because she acted recklessly and got a lot of people killed who didn't need to be killed. But by the end of this book, she finally has enough royal houses telling her that they support her as queen so that she can now actually become queen. And maybe the Caemlyn plot can finally move on. But even that had some pretty large-scale battles and things occurring in this book. This is the book of battles. At the end of the previous book, Egwene was captured by the White Tower, and in this book, we learn that the White Tower have decided to put her back on novice learning and basically torture her. It's all like, it's disciplinary, and every time she mentions that she's still the Amelin seat, or every time she refuses to do something, or every time she, acts out in class, I guess, she gets taken to the Mistress of Novices and, beaten in various ways. And Egwene talks a lot about how she tries to embrace the pain like the Aiel do so that she can make it through with her sanity intact. I don't tend to love chapters in books. I know they're necessary for the telling of a lot of stories, but I don't love chapters that just languish on a character's captivity and suffering. I find it just maybe it's a pacing issue, maybe it's because we're spending so much time just talking about them sitting in one place. But I don't love hearing about how they're being tortured all the time either. I'm not sitting there going, this is great, I'm enjoying this chapter. I'm there going, that's horrible. That's not just a Wheel of Time thing, that goes for all fiction. I remember I read a book called Half a King once, which is the first book in, I believe, a trilogy, and I believe the only Joe Abercrombie book I've ever read so far. And there was a lot of the protagonist being, I guess, spoilers for that book, mild spoilers, but there was a lot of the protagonist being enslaved in that book, and that wasn't much fun. It's like chapter 4. You know, there's even some of this in Brandon Sanderson's books, you know. This is a charge I'm laying at every fantasy author's feet, and I don't even know if it's a healthy critical thing to make, because, again, it's part of a story that needs to be told. It builds character. I'm just impatient to get on with the plot, and I don't love hearing characters suffer. That being said, I thought it was really masterfully done how Egwene slowly wins the hearts and minds of the other novices, and even accepted, and even like the mistress of novices herself in the White Tower, and it's really setting up Egwene to kind of overthrow Elida as the Amelin seat and become the one true Amelin seat who reforges the tower. So yeah, I did like those chapters as well. Trollocs. Do you remember Trollocs? Do you remember that this is a book series dealing with dark forces, which have these animalistic, dark, bestial forces like Trollocs and Murdrol and Golems and stuff? Yeah, that's a thing. It's not all infighting. 100,000 Trollocs attack Rand as he's still recovering from cleansing the taint on Sidene. And of course, if you remember, by the way, I was very excited to hear about the differences there would be in this world where the male half of a true source could be channeled without men going mad. And in this book, we did start to see Aes Sedai being slightly more accepting of the idea of the Ashaman, as they started to kind of learn that the male half of a true source had been cleansed, and there were these debates about, well, should we take some of them as warders, since they've taken some of us as warders? And you could see both with the rebel Aes Sedai and Elida's Aes Sedai, both of them in their own ways were starting to think about this, about how they might need to come together to fight the darkness. And the other thing I was really interested in was how would it change Rand's character. And while initially I didn't think Rand's character had changed much, sitting where I am from the end of this book looking back, I do think Rand feels more recognizably Rand than he has done in a while. Like, I'm looking at Rand's actions in this book and his POV chapters, and I'm comparing it to like that scene where he's in Camelin and he's grasping one of the Dark One's seals above his head, trying not to smash it because part of him wants to smash it. And I'm thinking, I think that was probably Rand at his maddest. I think he came closer to madness than maybe people give it credit for. But in this book, while he still has a lot going on, because that was my other concern, like, if he's cleansed the taint on Sidene, like, what if he's just free of woe and worry now? But no, he's still fated to die in battle. He's still got those never-healing wounds in his side. He still, for some reason, feels really nauseous when he embraces Sidene, and he's still got Lews Therin in his head, and in this book we see Lews Therin actually grasp Sidene when Rand tries to take it. And this is important in two different scenes. In one scene, in that Trolloc scene that I was talking about a few minutes ago, he has to, like, move his body while Lews Therin weaves, and he spins, like, death gates and fire blossoms and these crazy powers no one's ever seen before. And I just want to mention, by the way, I had been wondering if people would ever use the traveling gates as a weapon, because they did seem potentially weaponous, so I'm really glad that actually happened. But yeah, one scene, Rand had to basically just be a conduit for Lews Therin killing a bunch of Trollocs, and there was a really tense scene where Lews Therin is basically really wanting to, like, kill him and Rand so that he can finally rest, and Rand basically has to talk him down from the ledge and promise that they can die at Tarmangaiden. And then the other time it's really important is later on when he falls into a trap where, what's her face? I will go and check her name. Semirog is masquerading as... I didn't catch if she was masquerading as Tuon or if she was just masquerading as a royal member of the family, member of the royal family. But, you know, she basically springs a trap on Rand, and Rand goes... She shoots a fireball at him, and he instinctively throws out a hand to stop the fireball, because if he jumps out of the way, Min will die because she's behind him. And he can't grasp the true source in time, or the male half of it, because Lews Therin is also grasping for it, and so Rand loses a hand. And I think that is so cool. Not for Rand, poor guy, but a problem with a lot of protagonists in fantasy is that they're kind of infallible. And you see here that Rand is fallible. Like, he may be the prophesied hero of light. He may be prophesied to, like, save the world from a shadow and all this crazy stuff. And, you know, he's going to at least live till the end of a series because he's supposed to die in the final battle and all that. But he can still be wounded and affected. And, yeah, he loses a hand. And that's absolutely wild. He can still fail, and there can still be massive consequences for his failure. And I love as well I just think Rand's POV chapter in this entire sequence is really bloody well written. Like, I'm reminded of hearing stories about shell-shocked soldiers in World War II, when you see how Rand, like, his vision is blurry and he can't really tell where he is, and, like, he can't really hear well for a while because an explosion just went off right in front of him. And then as he kind of, like, becomes a little bit more conscious, a little bit more with it, when Nynaeve heals the stump of his hand and it is still a stump, he feels like he can still feel his hand. You hear first-hand accounts of people with amputated limbs who get like this ghostly feeling where they can still feel their limb and stuff. So if it was not already apparent, Robert Jordan did his research, and this was before like YouTube was like a widely accepted thing. This might have been before YouTube at all. I think YouTube was a thing in late 2005. I think Wikipedia was around, but I don't know, man. Like, you had to go to libraries to learn this stuff. you had to get VHSs and watch documentaries and stuff. It was a different world back then. I just want to acknowledge that. Anyway, Rand's point of view chapter there felt really, as someone who's never been through anything like that themselves, it felt very plausible and realistic. And you get a sense of just how hard Rand has to make himself be, because he sees that he has lost a hand. He's just like, ugh, I'm going to have to relearn how to use a sword, and I'm going to have to relearn everything. And that's all he really, he doesn't stop and cry. He's not shocked. And even Nynaeve says you must be in shock, but Min, through the bond, can feel that he's not in shock. He's just already, like, resigned himself to this is the new reality, and he has to get on with it. And that is Rand's tragedy as a character. He doesn't get to be a human being. He has to be the Dragon Reborn. And I love this, having Min in the bond. Now you can really start to see Rand from outside himself, even during his own POV chapters. And you can see, like, just how sad Min is for him, not just because he's lost his hand, but because he has to be the Dragon Reborn and he doesn't get to mourn the loss of his hand and that kind of thing. And just the toll that this war is taking on him, both body and spirit, I guess, is how people say that. Oh, I don't want to gloss over the little subplot. We get a loyal POV chapter, which was really nice, or at least POV passage in a chapter. And he finally marries the girl that he partially wants to marry and partially wants to run away from so he can continue to write his book. And as part of his POV chapter, we learn a fascinating bit of lore where, the Ogier are not of this world, it turns out. They're holding a meeting at the Great Stump to determine whether they need to leave this world because the last battle is coming, Tarmangaiden is coming. And then, another bit of really interesting lore, which I was wondering about, actually, because we already know there are other worlds in the Wheel of Time universe, is that Loyal's like, yeah, but that's not going to save us from Tarmangaiden. Tarmangaiden affects all worlds, and I find that fascinating. I want to know more about that, please, because I was thinking if there are extra worlds in the Wheel of Time, if the Wheel of Time's universe mirrors our own in that way, it doesn't mirror our own in the, at least as far as we know, in the fact that time apparently repeats itself in great cycles. An age long past, an age yet to come, all that stuff. And I'm like, so does that apply to an entire universe? And if so, what are the logistics of that? I think in the previous book, Rand mentions that he sees the creator as this gardener who, sows the seeds of life on worlds, but never sticks around to, he lets them grow of their own accord, and then he goes off to other worlds and cultivates more worlds. So yeah, all that stuff I'm absolutely fascinated with. There's also this idea of they're really starting to move all of the world's armies towards the Blight or the border, because the last battle is coming. There are all these signs of the last battle coming. And so Lan wants to go and join them, but Nynaeve tricks him and sends him away. And then there's this really cool little moment where she goes and starts to rally the Borderlands. Just like, on her off time, in her downtime, just in an evening, she quickly travels towards the Borderlands and goes around and tells people the last battle is coming and are they going to rally? And, it's Lan's brother that she talks to, and he's like, at the start of the passage, he's like, oh, I'm not going to go fight and die, that would be dumb. And then by the end of a passage, he's like, yes, I will fight for Molkir. There's a lot of that in this book, and it might be a little bit cheesy or hammy to some people, but I loved every second of it. And Nynaeve does that so that when Lan finally does catch up to the border, there will be an army waiting for him so that he won't go it alone. Also, as an aside, I think before she sends him away, they bang in a stable in front of a bunch of servants. That was wild. That pretty much does it for all the major plot lines. I do still have some notes of little things that interested me, though. So I know Arangar wasn't introduced in this book, But it's the first time I've really caught wind of the fact that she's a trans Forsaken. And I know this was written in 2005, and she wasn't necessarily written as a trans character in the way that we understand transgender things today. But if I remember right, she was another Forsaken, Ostagar, maybe? Or maybe I'm misremembering and that's someone else. But she died as a man and was reborn as a woman. I think the idea was that it was meant to be punishment from the Dark One. But the thing is, she prefers it this way. She mentions that she prefers life this way, and she remembers her past life from the perspective of a woman, which, quote-unquote, leads to some interesting... okay, this isn't a direct quote, I don't remember what she says, but she's like, it kind of doesn't really match up with reality, but that's how she remembers herself now. And she loves that she can, go dress shopping and, enjoy this other aspect of fashion that she previously hadn't been able to, which I find surprisingly prescient from Robert Jordan, especially since while there has been talk in the last few books of Aes Sedai being pillow friends sometimes, there hasn't been a lot of queer representation in Wheel of Time. And if you don't know, I am bi, and I do consider myself an ally to transgender people and queer people all across different spectrums of sexuality and gender identity. And while it's not something I was ever really expecting from this series, I am really delighted to see it here in whatever format it may show up in. And I hesitate to say that kind of thing because I feel like there'll be some diehard Wheel of Time people who don't have that kind of queer eye reading this series, and they will have missed some of this, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? It's not even really meant to be a thing. Shut up. Talking about some older media, sometimes I do say stuff like this and people say stuff like that back to me, but just, well, times change, people see things through different lenses, and that's where I'm at. Also, I like that she told Graendal she always had a thing for her, and obviously while there's a lot of ulterior motives behind her trying to romance Graendal, because all the Forsaken are horrible people and use each other in various ways, Graendal also has this kind of like gay moment of, I'd never considered that, but yeah, I might be down. I think a lot of Forsaken politics kind of goes over my head because you get it in drips and drabs in the middle of some fairly slow chapters sometimes, and my attention isn't always here. But I've just caught up to the fact that I guess Ishamael was reborn as Mordif, I always forget his name, but another Forsaken, or maybe that Murdrol, I don't even remember anymore if those are two different characters. I'm so sorry, I'm butchering this entire story. When I am done reading The Wheel of Time, by the way, I do intend to catch up on all the inevitable YouTube gold mines of things you may have missed, and, lore theories, and everything we know about, the wider world of A Wheel of Time through lore and that kind of thing. So if there's stuff that I've missed here, I will inevitably catch up to it one day. Will I ever reread A Wheel of Time? Who's to say? Now, in this book, there's a lot of the Dark One reaching out and touching the world, and you see things like food spoiling a lot sooner than it should, and ghosts roam the land. Like, remember that chapter I really appreciated in Crossroads of Twilight where Perrin went to this village which was like full of dead people walking? There's a lot more of that happening in the world. There's a really interesting chapter from Matt's perspective where he sees a village and he realizes too late it's not a real village. He's seen a village as it was like hundreds of years ago, and there's a merchant who goes to try and peddle his wares at this village, and Matt tries to shout a warning as reality reasserts itself and he sinks into the ground, which rises up to, I guess, correct itself to where it's meant to be. And Matt's like, he wishes that he could at least say to himself that the man was dead, but somehow he gets the impression that that was not the case. Some really horrifying shit goes down in this book. But I think the most curious thing, which I am attributing to the Dark One reaching out and touching the world, but I might be wrong on that front. The most curious thing is something that happens firstly in one of Fael's chapters, and then later, presumably not at the same time, presumably later in one of Perrin's chapters, and that's that the world ripples. There is, I think the chapter is called Something Strange Happens, at least for Fael's chapter, and just in the middle of various things happening, just completely unforeseen, unwarned of, the world ripples. And everyone's like, what? And then the world ripples again, and they're like, what is happening? And then the world ripples a third time, and Fael knows that if it ripples a fourth time, she will be carried away, and she won't exist anymore. And Perrin says it a little bit differently, but the same thing pretty much happens to him later in the book, and I'm like, what is happening? What are you talking about? Robert Jordan just throws in this complete curveball, and suddenly I'm more intrigued than I have ever been before. First of all, when it only happened to Fail, my theory was that it was happening to the entire world at the same time, and it was the effects of the final 3 seals on the Dark One's prison breaking. But when it happened again with Perrin later, I realised that couldn't be the case. The fact that reality itself is rippling makes me think that maybe it's a result of something one of the Forsaken is doing with Balefire or something. I'm really looking forward to finding out what this is all about, personally. But I find it so curious that this happened, like, locally, where Fail was, and then later on, locally, where Perrin was, and also they're also busy with their own problems that they don't really stop to talk about it or think about it all that much afterwards. I guess when you're in the end times and weird shit is occurring, you just kind of take it in your stride and you're thankful that you still exist. Like, goddamn. So I realised that Noel, who's part of Matt's party, is probably Jane Fastrider. Whenever I heard about them reading the book of the travels of Jane Fastrider, I assumed it was something that had happened hundreds of years ago, but I guess it happened within living memory. And Noel is this grizzled old man whose identity is kind of like harumphed about every now and again, and Matt isn't all that interested in it, but we do get interesting tidbits from Noel, and he's got all of these interesting stories that he tells. The kid that hangs out with Matt, whose name I've forgotten. You'll have to forgive me, there's literally like 3,000 names in this series. By the way, I realised the prophecy that says Matt has to give up half the light of the world to save it, I think he has to sacrifice the kid. Anyway, at one point Noel mentions that he is the cousin of Jane Fastrider, but the way he talks about Jane Fastrider leaving his wife behind and being a fool for doing so, he talks about it so bitterly, in my opinion, he has to just be Jane Fastrider. He talks about, like, things that Matt's done. He's like, damn, Jane Fastrider didn't even do that, and Jane Fastrider always meant to get around to doing that. You know, maybe I can do it for him. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Noel, I know who you are. Oh, here's another note I made. Just to show how ruthless and single-minded Perrin is in this book, they had a moment where one of, I believe, the Shan soldiers started vomiting up beetles, and he basically died vomiting up beetles and kind of like ended up flattening, like he was just like a pile of skin on the floor by the end of a time that he was emptied of beetles, which again is meant to be like this, the end times are upon us, the Dark One is touching the world kind of thing, and everyone in the room is rightfully horrified and completely shaken, and Perrin's just stamping on the beetles. He's like, what? They're just beetles? Can we get back to saving my wife? And I've got to say, I get that he's meant to be single-minded and ruthless and driven, but I feel like that was a little bit over the top. I feel like even Perrin in that moment should have been like, God damn. But obviously it's meant to illustrate that he doesn't give a damn anymore. He doesn't give a damn that the Shan are an unethical ally to have so long as they continue leashing Domani. He doesn't care that he's not doing what Rand wants him to be doing right now. He just wants his goddamn wife back, man. I'll be interested to see where his story goes in book 12 now that he has his wife back, and maybe he can start to look up and take his surroundings in and realise what's happening to the world, and that maybe he's got wider responsibilities. Maybe he'll realise that selling out all of those wise ones to become Domani leashed ones wasn't the best course of action, not even from just an ethical standpoint, but he just gave him a bunch of soldiers, a bunch of like super weapons. Oh, I did already talk about it before, but in my notes I wanted to accentuate the fact that Loyal's POV chapter as he got married was just so cute. All those mentions of like, oh, but she did have lovely ears and such a delicately flat nose. A lot of that, by the way, is really helped along by Michael Kramer's narration. I've said it a lot in the earlier videos in this Blurbal Reasoning series, but Michael Kramer and Kate Redding really do bring these books alive, and I'm so grateful for them. Oh, another moment I forgot to mention, as Rand tells Luce Ferrin that he needs to be hard as Luce Ferrin was. Luce Ferrin says, "You're harder than I ever was." Which is an interesting thing to consider, the idea that Rand is farther along down the road of, you know, imperiousness and like ruling with an iron fist than Luce Ferrin ever was. And my last note is just that alongside the Arangar stuff, there's just a lot more talk about pillow friends than there ever was before. Like Elida, the Amelin seat herself, is just like, oh, I've been considering renewing that relationship with that other Aes Sedai whose name I forgot, because they were pillow friends as novices. And obviously, again, she's using that for political reasons, but she's like, you know, it might be fun. We've still yet to see any romantic interactions between men, at least outright, that I've noticed in this series. So hopefully we get to see that before the series is over. But I don't know if Brandon Sanderson would do that. I don't know if he's ever done that in his books. I guess we'll find out. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening to my take on Knife of Dreams by Robert Jordan. Again, this is the last book Robert Jordan wrote himself, and I will be forever grateful for the Wheel of Time series as written by him, and I will continue to be grateful because, from what I've read, because I have been curious about this, while Brandon Sanderson did the actual, like, writing work, if you want to put it that way, for the last 3 books, and I hear he did a great job, and I'm really looking forward to reading them, he was following detailed notes left by Robert Jordan as, like, a contingency in the event of his unfortunate passing. So while I know Brandon Sanderson is the the quote-unquote author of the next 3 books, Robert Jordan is still the first name of those 2 authors for a reason, and the end of the series wouldn't exist without him, and no matter what I say about Brandon Sanderson's work going forwards, I will always keep that in mind. So yeah, I will see you back here anywhere between a week and a half to 5 months for the next Blurbal reasoning for the Gathering Storm, and other than that, I will see you in whatever I make next.